After Peter and Zachary's opening gestures of tireless informality, I thought I might try and go one stage further in this final session and do it topless in just a pair of shorts. But thankfully, for all of us, I'm sure British modesty's prevailed. So as Peter says, it falls to me to try and weave together some of the themes from the past 2 days, 3 days, in fact, if we include the pre-meeting on science diplomacy, and to suggest a few ways forward, really to just shape this final period of discussion. I'll try and be as brief as I can because I think it's obviously much more important to hear from all of you. And I think we should start just by celebrating, really, what we've achieved by being here in Auckland and having such a rich, informed and constructive set of discussions with a really diverse array of international participants from different governments, different science organisations, different international bodies. As Roger Pilkey said yesterday, and I fully agree, this is the most significant international meeting on scientific advice that's ever taken place. For sure, there have been bigger meetings on specific domains, climate, you name it. But to get a group like this together to raise the debate to the meta level of how we organise and think about scientific advisory processes is very unusual. And I'm sure I speak for all the members of the organising committee when I say it's exceeded our expectations. For sure, if we do it again, we could do more to ensure more diverse participation from certain countries and regions. We could do with fewer all-male panels. We could do with more time for questions. But as well as the conversation here in the room, it's been really fantastic to see the buzz that's being created out there in the wider world. We were told this afternoon that on social media, the conference has so far reached 4 million participants, and real praise to the team here that's been working on all of that. We've had the fantastic website of the conference, which is now a really rich resource of articles and resources in this whole space. We've also been running a series of articles on the Guardian website. These are the two of the most recent ones from this morning. A piece by Professor Arimoto and Yasushi Sato on science advice in Japan, and one yesterday from Mark Wolpert. So do have a look at those as well. And Nature too, we heard of course from Phil this morning, but Nature's been doing a fantastic job not only to cover the meeting in this week's issue, but also to put up on its site a really rich archive of its articles over recent years on science advice. So, you know, we are here, but we're also part of a much bigger conversation that I'm sure will continue. And of course, we need, again, to extend particular thanks to the man who's made all of this possible. New Zealand may be a small country, but it has a giant of a chief scientific advisor, and I think while many people have worked tirelessly to make this meeting happen, we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to Peter as the man at the centre of it all. He's not only been the driving force behind this summit, but over the past 5 years, I think he's done more than any other practicing science advisor to ask tough questions and provide a stream of thoughtful answers about the dilemmas, opportunities, processes, and practicalities of science advice. So please just join me in showing him our appreciation for what he's done. So on to business. What are the main lessons of the last 2 days? I've borrowed this slide from Go Science, from Sir Mark Wolpert. We've learnt through a lot of the presentations here that there are, of course, a very diverse range of national models and systems of scientific advice. But alongside that diversity, many of the challenges we face are really the same. They're challenges of balancing independence, transparency and influence, of navigating through crises and emergencies, of balancing between formal and informal processes of advice, of charting a careful route through the choppy political, ethical and ideological waters that we encounter in many of these debates, and about ensuring that the supply side works for sure, but also giving a lot of attention to the demand side of advisory systems. As Mark Wolpert said yesterday, building up government's appetite for the scientific method one step at a time. And we heard from Mark and from a number of others a persuasive account of the value of science advisors, particularly the role of the chief scientific advisor, embedded within government as a vital transmission mechanism. But we've also heard about the equally important work that's being done through national academies, through expert committees, through advisory councils and other structures. And we've heard about some of the very innovative approaches this morning that are being adopted at the international level through assessments like IPBES and new bodies like the UN Scientific Advisory Board. For me, one of the most encouraging aspects of this meeting is that we've avoided getting into a rather sterile debate about which model is best, and instead, I think, recognised together that truly effective advisory systems are an ecosystem. They operate, as Bill Coglazier told us yesterday, with many moving parts. In a growing number of countries, individual CSAs are a highly visible and important part of the mix. If you like, they're the charismatic megafauna of that advisory ecosystem. And having worked in many parts of the UK system myself, in think tanks, are very close to the politics of it all, inside government, as Director of Science Policy for the Royal Society, and now as a science policy academic, I wholeheartedly endorse Mark Wolpert's argument that a strong CSA makes for a stronger National Academy and a stronger system overall. But science advisors, despite all of that, aren't superheroes. Roger Pilkey makes this point very nicely. They can't single-handedly hold the rein of multiple debates across multiple parts of government, nor are they able to swoop down and somehow cut through these intractable knots that we often find where science, technology, values, and politics collide. And for me, one of the many interesting points to come out of Anne Glover's talk yesterday, and what a fantastic talk that was. I mean, again, I think I'd certainly like to show appreciation for Anne for what for me was a real highlight of a very, very good meeting. But one of the very interesting points to come out of Anne's talk was the vital importance of good staff and of supporting structures around the CSA. So as well as that wider set of external connections to academics, to universities, to others, these nuts and bolts aspects of the advisory systems are equally vital, but they're less visible and they're much less frequently discussed. But they are critical, as I'm sure Mark, Peter, Anne and others would agree. And there's lots of lessons to draw from Anne's talk, but I think if her experience teaches us one thing, it's that if you have the CSA but not enough support, and if the connections aren't working, and if the budget isn't there, and if the institutional leverage isn't designed, there's only so much you can do. So I think, we come out of 2 days of discussion with a renewed respect for diversity, a recognition that science advisory systems are part of larger political cultures. They're part of processes of public reason. In Sheila Jasloff's nice phrase, she has this idea of civic epistemologies. And science advice is just one part of that and can't be separated from it. I put this other picture up of this report, the kid with the spiky hair. This is a report that came out just last night from the Council of Canadian Academies in Ottawa, and I was fortunate to be on the group that wrote this report, and it's looking at Canada's science culture. And Canada, of course, a country where the place of science in politics and society has come in for gone through quite a rough ride in recent times. But that's just one example of an effort to try and think through these questions in the context of a specific culture. But we can, while respecting that diversity, still have a meaningful conversation across systems. We can talk about common principles, we can talk about common design features that enable and support effective scientific advice. And as we heard yesterday, coordination across systems is particularly key when we're dealing with crises and emergencies. It's here where, as Peter reminded us in the last session, sheer urgency often blurs the lines between advice and policy, and where we can perhaps make the easiest and most rapid progress in developing common protocols and practices, as Mark, Anne, and others have suggested. And the other area where there's lots of scope for exchange and dialogue across systems is in navigating these contested debates that we've heard a lot about, what Peter called post-normal science advice, when the facts are uncertain, when values are in dispute, and the stakes are high. And whereas Roger Pilkey reminded us yesterday, the role of the advisor may in fact be to step back and safeguard the integrity of advisory processes rather than step up and join the fray as just one advocate among many. As well as looking across different systems to help us tiptoe through these difficult debates, I think we can also gain a lot by looking backwards and drawing more systematically from earlier controversies. So Mark Walpert mentioned yesterday that this year, in October in fact, marks the 50th anniversary of Solly Zuckerman's appointment as the first cross-government chief scientific advisor in the UK, and that prompted me to dig out this picture from the archive. This was taken in 1970, and here we see Solly Zuckerman on the left, with the then Prime Minister in the middle, Harold Wilsdon, visiting a place called Monk's Wood, which is now closed, but was then a centre for ecological research not far from Cambridge. And they're talking about the effects of pesticides on peregrines. And I think in many respects that photo represents our idealised image of a kind of golden age of scientific advice in which the advisor, the trusted advisor, stands at the shoulder of the politician, helping him directly to interpret the implications of research. But pull the camera lens back by 100 metres, and this was the scene outside that very building that same morning. An enormous protest by farmers who were upset about various aspects of the then Labour government's agricultural policies. So although the challenges we face in contemporary debates about climate, GM crops, fracking, pesticides can at times feel overwhelming, and I mean I'm sympathetic to the sort of post-normality that gets talked about, we do also need to draw lines and continuities between from others now across different systems and from the past. And as well as learning from history, another part of the meeting that I've certainly found encouraging is to see so many of our speakers emphasising the value of engineering. We heard from Brian Collins in the last session, and of social science in the advisory mix, and the associated challenges of multi, inter, even transdisciplinary science advice. Several of our speakers emphasised the need to conceive of science advice in terms of Wissenschaft rather than purely STEM. Operationalising that shift, pluralising, diversifying the advisory system is, I think, going to be a real priority and challenge for lots of advisory systems over the next few years, particularly as the task is not only to bring in more disciplines, but also to bring in a broader range of methods. And we've heard various people mention the use of randomised controlled trials, behavioural sciences, big data, and other more qualitative modes of public engagement. It's great to hear that 2 of the new departmental CSAs here in New Zealand will be social scientists. And this is a debate that we're having a lot right now in the UK system and making lots of progress. Mark Walpert mentioned yesterday things like the What Works centres in the UK that have been set up to bring social and behavioural science evidence into the mix. I just mentioned briefly we produced, a group of us, an edited book to mark the appointment of Mark as GCSA in the UK last April. This was one of the first things that he launched when he took up the post, and just recommend that it's up there as an open access resource with lots of essays focusing primarily on the UK system, but looking in detail at some of these questions around multidisciplinarity, public engagement, values, ethics, etc. A related point that's been bubbling away in the background of our discussions that came up in the last session are the possibilities created from all of this new knowledge, all of these methods, to develop what we might call a science of scientific advice. There's been for a few years now, prompted in fact by an earlier presidential science advisor in the US, a program of Science for Science and Innovation policy, which is focused mostly on the policy for science side of the system. But on this side, the science advisory side, we see lots of scope to blend these methods, draw these approaches together, and say increasingly rigorous and robust things about how and why particular systems work and others don't. I think advisors in their work need, wherever possible, to draw more systematically on research in political science, social psychology, behavioural economics, and science studies, which investigates why certain kinds of expert advice are acted upon and others not. And this requires concerted efforts from both sides. It's not just the science advisors asking for it, it's us in the social science and other worlds getting better at producing useful, relevant material that can be used productively. Sheila Jasanoff, who I mentioned before, a Harvard professor of science studies, has a lovely essay in that green book we published where she talks particularly about the contribution of science studies, which many people still, with echoes of the science war, see as she says here, something that can be associated with unproductive wheel spinning and relativism. But as this quote says, at the same time, work that probes into the foundations of knowledge making can enable those wheels to spin with traction. And she has this lovely quote, which I'm just going to read out. If judges may not presume to stand above the law, still less should science advisors seek to insulate themselves from the critical gaze of the science of scientific advice. And at the risk of slipping now in my own talk from honest broker to advocate for my own field, I do think we need to invest more in systematic comparative analysis and evaluation of advisory systems. This was raised by our Finnish colleague as a question at the end of the last session, but one which I'd wholeheartedly endorse. My own outfit, SPRU, is a well-known, long-standing centre for science, innovation, policy research, but there are many others here in the room and more still outside who I think would relish the opportunity to help the practitioners in the room to address these challenges. So we do need to think that through. We need, for sure, to talk, but we need to underpin our own field with the kind of evidence that we demand elsewhere. So, where next? Above all, when we were planning the meeting and as we've come up to it and as we've watched it unfold, I think the hope of those of us that have been involved in setting it up is that this represents just the start of an important conversation. Pretty much all our speakers, or at least the ones that I've heard and the ones I've spoken to in the coffee breaks, seem to agree that this has been a valuable discussion, that advisory systems, however diverse, however different, do benefit from this kind of exchange of experiences, insights and ideas. And I just wanted to end with a few bullets really to help shape the discussion that Peter's going to chair now. And I'll just run through those very quickly. Where next? One concrete thing will happen for sure, whatever we say now in the next hour. We will produce a detailed report of the meeting, which ICSU will then publish and endorse. And this will be a development of the briefing paper that we produced ahead of time, but then massively enriched and expanded with all the material that's been produced and discussed here at the meeting. Looking beyond that, there are questions as much as options. There seems, as I say, to be general enthusiasm and support for maintaining and developing this kind of network. That's something we need to discuss. I think it's something that many of us would welcome. At the same time, we recognise that if we were to do that, we need to expand and further diversify the steering committee that has been involved in shaping this meeting. We need to bring in other countries. We need to think about other dimensions of diversity. I think at the same time, we need to maintain what has been quite an unusual and rich aspect of this meeting, which has been the mix of practitioners, policymakers, and academics thinking about these issues. It's that chemistry that I think helps to produce the kind of high-quality discussions that we've heard. There's a particular opportunity for ICSU to continue leading on a lot of this, but also to work more closely with the OECD. We heard from Professor Arimoto about the report that the OECD is preparing on scientific advisory systems, and it would seem sensible that ICSU and the OECD together, working with the group that Sir Peter has chaired here, could be the organisational, institutional vehicle through which this conversation continues. And one thing that's nice about having ICSU and the OECD is, in a sense, you've got within that both the supply side, ICSU from the science community, and the OECD as an organisation of governments representing the demand side. In terms of what we then do with the network, there's clearly lots of issues and challenges that have been raised, and I won't rehearse them all again now exhaustively, but one thing we could work on is the development of a more cohesive and agreed set of principles for what constitutes an effective advisory system, how it works. We could draw on principles that have been developed elsewhere, the UK, Japan. Many countries have these sorts of protocols and guidelines, and that might be a useful and productive task. That's something to discuss. There are many other areas and topics that we've raised where more detailed, thorough work could be done. We think there would be a value as well in bringing together a large meeting of this kind, not every year, which we probably feel might be overkill, but again, your views on this would be valuable, but perhaps every 2 years. And the sequence and location of those is by no means confirmed, but there's the possibility in 2016 of hosting a meeting in the UK on the edges and linked informally to the ESOF meeting that will be taking place in Manchester that year. At this meeting, and I don't want to overly embarrass our Japanese colleagues by tying them down to something, but there's been talk with Japanese colleagues here about the potential to host a 2018 meeting in Tokyo, which I think would be a great opportunity. It would be better if we'd done it in the year of the Olympics, but still 2018 will do. And it would be good, of course, to get the discussion moved outside of purely systems with a chief scientific advisor like New Zealand and the UK. But, you know, alongside and beyond those major meetings, there are limits to what you can do in a forum like this, a big room with 200 or more people. And there will also be a need for other intermediary workshops, smaller meetings, smaller gatherings, perhaps some just with practitioners, other fora where we can tackle and as Brian said in the last session, you know, digest and eat the food that we've smelt cooking over these 2 days. So those are just a few suggestions, and of course we'll welcome your thoughts. Peter was kind enough to mention this piece that Rob Doubleday and I wrote in Nature a couple of years ago now as something that struck a chord with him and fed into thinking about a meeting of this kind. You know, I think for me, certainly personally, we could never have imagined that those kind of discussions would lead or contribute to something like this. It's been a great privilege, certainly for me, to be involved. I hope you have all found it a useful, productive and stimulating couple of days. And as I say, we very much look forward to the conversation continuing. Thank you.